Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Koshy, Director of the Unit of Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and I'd like to welcome you all to this lecture on the open secret of racial capitalist violence by Jodi Melamed. Jodi Melamed is Associate Professor of English and Africana Studies at Marquette University. Her work has been so influential across a range of fields: ethnic studies, post-colonial studies, indigenous studies, and globalization studies, because her scholarship not only transects these fields, but offers meticulous historical materialist accounts of their interrelations. Her groundbreaking first book, Represent and Destroy: Rationalizing Violence in the New Racial Capitalism, like her current research, aims to provide, quote, an anti-racist critique of contemporary global capitalism and an anti-capitalist critique of historically dominant US anti-racisms, end quote. Focusing on the racial break marking US global ascendancy after World War II, her book traces the genealogy of various official US anti-racisms, starting from racial liberalism running through the 40s through the 60s, moving to liberal multiculturalism from the 80s to the 90s, and ending in neoliberal multiculturalism as a millennial formation. Her study offered a new theory of racial formation and a globe-girdling racial system after World War II that diverged from the accounts of scholars like Howard Wyman. In Represent and Destroy, she notes, and I quote, because this is a good bridge to her current research, racialization converts the effects of differential value-making processes into categories of difference that make it possible to order, analyze, describe, and evaluate what emerges out of forced relations as the permissible content of other domains of US modernity, such as the law, economy, and politics. Her next book project is titled Capitals, Metabolisms, and investigates the representational and relational dimensions of what she calls biofinancialization, which is the nexus linking life and financialization in neoliberalism. Jodi has received many awards, and I'm just going to list some of them. They include a Fulbright, a Woodrow Wilson postdoctoral fellowship, and grants from the American Studies Association, the Social Science Research Council, the Mellon Foundation, and the Wisconsin Humanities Council. Please join me in welcoming Jodi Melamed.
Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Good. Thank you, Susan, for that really thoughtful introduction. And I just really want to express my sincere sort of gratitude to Dr. Koshy for her personal generosity to me over these last months and for her work, of which I am a huge fan. I want to start by acknowledging the people of this land. As Jody Bird reminded attendees of this year's American Studies Association conference in Chicago, there are no longer indigenous nations within the border of Illinois. They have been forcibly removed through colonialism, territorial acquisition, genocide, and something that I will talk about tonight as settler capitalist logisticality. But I want to acknowledge that the people who have known this land as a relative for millennia remain our hosts on it, including the Potawatomi, the Sauk and the Fox, the Peoria and the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Chickasaw, Kickapoo, Waia, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, and the Shawnee. And I also want to say that I'm very mindful of what this campus has experienced and who I'm speaking about tonight when I talk about administrative violence, okay? It is, the Stephen Slade's firing and the undermining of American Indian studies here on this campus was really very much on my mind these last couple of years, and it's influenced my thinking about what I'm calling rights-based capitalist violence, which, in order to do its work as well as possible, needs to circulate in as context-free an environment as possible. I think it's no coincidence that scholars and subjects most targeted for repression under the aegis of protecting free speech or protecting individual rights or civility, Steve Salaida, but also Kiango Yamahata Taylor, Rabab Abdulhadi, also work on Palestine, indigeneity, and race, that these are the ones most able to contextualize radical right weaponizations of already weaponized liberal rights abstractions as they try to shift what we think of, to shift the meaning of rights towards even more property supremacist versions in line with what I'll be talking about today as neoliberal, financial, extractive, and logistical capitalism. And I just also want to underline how all the work we do, even though it's like one person standing up here, is really always already social. I want to acknowledge that everything I'm saying here tonight is very influenced by conversations with 3 of my co-editors for a forthcoming journal of social text. That's Chandan Reddy, Alyosha Goldstein, and Jodi Bird. And I also want to say I'm presenting super, super new work. First time I've presented it, so you guys are going to be entering into the social process of me doing my work, and all of your reactions, your interventions will certainly be influential. So thank you all really for being here and for listening. So my book project, or my title, The Open Secret of Racial Capitalist Violence, may be a little bit misleading because my focus is not on the open secret, but on how racial capitalism, or we might just say capitalism because all capitalism is racial capitalism, maintains its violence as an open secret. How the violence capitalism requires is given impunity in advance. My book project presents a theory of administrative power as the capacity to turn the violence necessary for capital accumulation into an open secret again and again under the guise of the routine calculations and everyday procedures of democratic governance. It shows how procedural violence today is predisposed and conditioned by the interoperations of racial and colonial logics. I look at how liberalism's core concepts depoliticize and normalize the force used to conform people and life worlds to the partitions through which capital circulates. And it turns out that the building blocks of liberal capitalist modernity, the property form, possessive individualism, and rights abstractions are really good ways of doing these things, as is economic rationality itself, the abstract that capitalism both releases and requires, to kind of play off Gayatri Spivak's work there a little bit. So for me, administrative violence is a kind of managerial anti-politics. I think of it as the inextricable, I don't know if I said that word right, that's a hard one, inextricable signature, the inextricable authoritarian signature of racial colonial capitalism written in the language of liberalism. And in the book, I also look to movements, intellectuals, and kinds of cultivated practical consciousness that give the lie to administrative power, the social separateness and expropriations of collectivity it demands, and the impunity it seeks. So I want to start with a quote calling out racial capitalism's open secret from Dr. William Barber II. You guys know him. He's now one of the co-chairs of the Poor People's Campaign. At this time, he was president of the North Carolina NAACP. It is the time of the police killing of Keith Lamont Scott in front of his apartment building. In this quote, he's calling out this open secret of racial capitalist violence in response to right-wing accusations that the uprising in response to the police killing was violent. Quote, "Anyone who is concerned about violence in Charlotte should note that no one declared a state of emergency when the city's schools were resegregated, creating a school-to-prison pipeline for thousands of poor African-American children. Few voiced outrage over the damage caused when 500,000 North Carolinians were denied health insurance because the legislature refused to expand Medicaid. When Charlotte's poor black neighborhoods were afflicted with disproportionate law enforcement during the war on drugs, condemning a whole generation to bad credit and a lack of job opportunities, our elected representatives didn't call it violence. When immigration officers raid homes and snatch undocumented children from bus stops, they don't call it violence. But all of these policies in practice do violence to the lives of thousands of Charlotte residents. As a pastor and an organizer, I do not condone violent protest, but I must join the Charlotte demonstrators in condemning the systemic violence that threatened Mr. Scott's body long before an officer decided to use lethal force against him." So the open secret here is that black and brown lives have already been put under the sign of expropriability as the condition of contemporary public policy. North Carolina cannot name municipal zoning, public health policy, and law enforcement practitioners as purveyors of violence because to the state, these are administrative matters that process in the name of liberal democratic reason. It may seem like there are affinities here with what Charles Mills calls white ignorance and Manu Vimalashari, Juliana Hupiges, and Alyosha Goldstein call colonial unknowing, and there are. But rather than underline, as they do, what white settler supremacy forgets or makes opaque, I want to focus on how it knows the categories of commensurate making and transactability that at once enact, whitewash, and make inactionable the violence realized with, for, and as a capital accumulation. Barbara calls this violence systemic, but I think we need to think of it as constitutive as much as systemic, instituting as much as institutional, along the lines of something I'll call the violence of the setup, which is not a one-time thing, but a ceaseless rational material process of setting up, making transactable, putting into the value form for what Marx called the capital relation. The second moment of administrative power I'm trying to put my finger on, closer to what Barbara calls systemic, is the power to manage how social relations appear to be mediated. The circulation that realizes capital and at the same time lends a realization effect to the social relations of capital accumulation, so that the logics underpinning liberalism and capitalism appear to cover all possible or desirable modes of collective existence. And so to think more about this, I'm going to turn briefly to the text of Marx on primitive accumulation. That's how it's usually translated, but I'm going to translate it as originary accumulation. These parts of Capital 1 generally get read as a description of how violence is part of the transition in England from feudalism to capitalist modernity. They also get read analytically to think about the difference between really violent military and political violence, extra-economic coercion, and then what Marx called the silent compulsion of economic arrangements. My readings follow scholars of settler political economy, such as Robert Nichols and Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard, who generalize originary accumulation as a process through which to think about how non-capitalist forms of life are forcibly incorporated into capitalist relations. Importantly, these scholars of settler political economy, to the difference of many other kinds of Marxist scholars, do not see this capture as total. If capital is circulation, the first thing it has to circulate are its own relations of production. Administrative power pretends to conquer the mediation of social relations, but it never fully does. I translate the German word Ursprünglich as originary because it expresses the repetition of a jumping off point for circulation, which has to happen again and again under stress from within and without, a constant rebirthing of the capital form and its accompanying violence made to appear as inactionable as the violence of a birth. And here I'm kind of alluding to a section in Marx in the Genesis of Industrial Capital, where he talks about capital coming into the world dripping from head to toe, from every pore with blood and dirt. So chapter 26 of Capital is titled The Secret of Originary Accumulation, but it's a secret not in the sense of people don't know about it. It's a secret in the sense of a cover story that nobody believes, like a fairy tale. And this is it, a fairy tale about the origins of property, how the wealthy got wealthy. Quote, "Long ago, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth and the latter sort had nothing to sell but their own skins. And from this original sin dates the poverty of the great majority, who despite all their labor have up to now nothing to sell but themselves, and the wealth of the few that increases constantly, although they have long since ceased to work. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in defense of property. In actual history, as is well known, and the word is bekanntlich, so it's obvious that it's something everybody knows, like notorious, conquest, enslavement, robbery, murder, in short, force, continue to play the greatest role. Right and hard work were, from von jeher is the word he uses, always already, the sole means of enrichment, naturally with the exception each time of this year. In reality, the methods of originary accumulation are anything but idyllic." So I like to cite this passage, which might sound familiar to you, right, as a trace in the text of Marx that all capitalism is racial capitalism, right? It's a tale of capitalism's original diversity, the lazy and the virtuous, right? Which kind of captures what I think of as the trick of racialization. Capital cannot be capital unless it produces and moves through relations of severe inequality among human groups, creditors and debtors, landlords, those dispossessed of land, right? And racism enshrines the inequality that capitalism requires. Just as fictions of unequal human worth or capacity, that is race, fictions of unequal human worth or capacity, coordinate and justify capitalism's asymmetry, so too does administration according to the logics of property and appropriation, not only in the past, but in the present and in the anticipated future. As the passage says, the passage tells us, right and hard work were always already the sole means of enrichment, naturally the exception each time of this year. And I think of this as the as-if of administration. The violence of the present is always able to be put into a state of exception when it seems to contradict the right and hard work, ownership and possessive individualism that vouchsafes the rightness and inevitability of how wealth accrues and to whom. And this recursivity, this originary move, right, that's part of the administrative power I'm talking about, is similar to something Aileen Morton Robinson writes about as the white possessive. And that's the process through which the materiality of significations, like buildings that seem to have owners, like deeds that seem to, give something to somebody. It's the very materiality of these significations that are perceived as evidence of ownership by those who have already taken possession, right? By those who have already stolen them. Administrative forms allow reigning regimes of capital to appear to themselves to get away with it again and again as they seek to mediate social relations and appear to conform them for accumulation through circulation's realization effect. Alyosha Goldstein catches hold of this in terms of how the administration of inheritance transits violence that originates in colonialism and racial slavery into the present. He looks at how the fractionation of landed property for Native people since the allotment era and the partition of land held as tenancy in common, which disproportionately affects Black farmers, circulate past dispossession into the present. Inheritance allows the wealthy to acquire fractionated land and, quote, provides a genealogical distance from conquest, genocide, and colonial slavery that offers a cover of ostensible innocence that launders accumulated fortune. While for Native peoples, descendants of enslaved Africans and other racialized people dispossessed by colonization, inheritance endures as a struggle and a demand. And I really like this part about enduring as a struggle and a demand because it emphasizes that what Marx refers to in his discussions of originary accumulation as the Scheidungsprozess, the kind of process of cutting or separating. For Marx, the first thing you had to separate, right, was land from labor, people from the land, right? It emphasizes, this enduring struggle and demand, emphasizes that the Scheidungsprozess does not end other circulations or economies of meaning, relationality, matter, and life. The Black radical tradition, critical ethnic and post-colonial theories of culture, and emphatically indigenous critical theory and teachers teach us to see the over and done with of the Scheidungsprozess as a false appearance. For example, Glenn Coulthard and Michi Sagik Nashnabig scholar Leanne Simpson theorize what they call grounded normativity, land-based norms of indigenous laws that uphold relations of reciprocity that continue to shape engagement with the human and non-human world. And if you'll bear with me for a minute, I want to share with you guys my favorite example of thinking about how capitalist circulations do not destroy, but overlap with grounded indigenous circulations rooted in an interconnectivity in which land and non-human elements also have agential significance. So my way of thinking that is to think about the Menominee Nation's trees, right? I don't know if you guys know Menominee Nation. I'm from Wisconsin, right? Sort of up in Wisconsin. If you look at the United States from space, there's like a flash of green, and that's the Menominee Nation. And that's where they have these forests that are incredible. Like pine trees are like huge. They're like redwoods, and they're dripping with sap. They've had incredible relationships with these forests for a very long time. So trees, the Menominee is also a good example because they were quote unquote terminated in 1961, but never disappeared as a nation and were officially retribalized in the eyes of the US government in the 70s. But their trees are simultaneously central to Menominee tribal enterprises, which sells them as lumber, cuts them down, and gives tribal members a stumpage fee, right? But these grandmothers and grandfathers are also part of cycles of gifting and honoring obligations. So the Menominee recently gifted Milwaukee, where I'm from, Milwaukee's Indian Community School, a big, beautiful, amazing tree to literally support the school, right, be in the middle of the school. And in 2016, fulfilled diplomatic and kinship responsibilities by bringing trees to Standing Rock to become wood and keep people warm. So my project focuses on 3 domains of administration that work to reproduce capitalist violence as an open secret by seeking to operationalize what the human can mean for capitalism, so that means through repertoires of rights and race, to operationalize land or territoriality for capital circulations, often through colonial routines, and to repress what it represents as disorder through capitalist making and capitalist preserving violence done by agents of law and order. So I see these 3 domains of administration. I think of them as police procedures, the exercise of rights, and then geo-economic strategies as all working together, right? But today, I'll only really be able to talk about geo-economic strategies, but I wanted to just give you a little bit of what I mean by the other 2. So in terms of police procedures, I'm interested in the police as the visible hand of the market, as literal political economy. Happy to talk about that later. And in police impunity as something that can be lent to capitalist violence more readily as it becomes more formally rule-based. In terms of rights, I'm interested in how contemporary appropriations of liberal rights abstractions by radical right and ultra-capitalist libertarian actors is working to recalibrate rights, especially free speech, property, state, and individual rights as what I think of as the right to be unencumbered by concern for the well-being of others and the planet, right? Taking what we mean by rights, trying to shift it so that all rights kind of become the right to be unencumbered by concern for the well-being of others and the planet. But today I'm going to focus on geo-economic strategies of administrative power in terms of logisticality, the organizing, managing, and coordinating of flows of things in order to continually materialize and operationalize infrastructures of ownership for those who have taken possession. Centering logistics, a colonial military and capitalist science that has come into its own as a technique of valorization alongside extractive and financialized global capitalism, brings into focus geoeconomic strategies of power that work by trying to manage, regulate, and control mobility and immobility. On the ground, this means borders, checkpoints, highways, container ships, free trade zones, pipelines, reservations, information systems, security zones, trade agreements, transportation corridors, ports, supply chains. You guys are getting the idea, right? Global assembly lines, right? Deborah Cowan calls logistics, quote, political forms of knowledge and calculations that present themselves as purely technical. She and a bunch of other folks kind of think of them as starting a kind of critical logistics studies thing, examine how logistics is reshaping global governance and shifting relations between capital and state, territory and jurisdiction, and labor and life. So any supply chain management folks in here, or business school folks? Okay, I have a lot of supply chain management students in my classes, and I get some good responses from this. Okay, just checking, just trying to see what I had here. Okay, thanks. So logistics presents itself as a kind of apotheosis of capitalism as pure circulation, pure form, always on the move, with value being added at every step of the supply chain, every just-in-time coming together of labor and investment. It's a dream of a planet unbordered to capital in all its forms, all its fluidity, organized for ceaseless value creation, ceaseless circulation, and to quote Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, logistics is no longer content with diagrams or with flows, with calculations or with predictions. It wants to live in the concrete itself, in space at once, time at once, form at once. Of course, the dream of logistics is also the nightmare of what Western Shoshone scholar Ned Blackhawk calls imperial violence over the land. It's the nightmare of containment, of global resource wars, of the use of force to arrange people, objects, space, and time according to the demands of capital. So most scholars of logistics trace its genealogy to World War II, which is represented as a war won or lost based on distributions of oil, troops, gas, technology, and armaments. The post-war era brings the rise of sophisticated computer technology, the invention of containerism, and the increasing entanglement of corporate and military logistics with the rise of the RAND Corporation at one historical end and the privatization of military supply chains and security during the Gulf War with KBR, Halliburton, and Blackwater, leading into an ever more logistical present. So the self-representation of logistics really wears its heart on its sleeve, and I thought I would just give it to you by showing you a quick minute or so video of BlackBerry trying to sell some software that they talk about as securing the enterprise of things. I want to apologize in advance. This is really assaultive. It's really martial, but here it is. I don't know, do I have sound in? I must, okay. Oops, stop. All right, we can get the lights back up. It has to end with humanitarianism, right? That's pretty much a given, okay? Saskia Sassen defines territoriality as claim making with power. Logistical capitalism claims the whole planet as its field of territorializing, with every endpoint being a new starting point. With its fantasy of uninterrupted flow subtended by intense paranoia and militarism, every flow has to be securitized, borders, gateways, zones, and corridors. With this ever-tightening relationship between extractive and logistical capitalism with militarism, it should be no surprise to us that the former CEO of ExxonMobil was our Secretary of State for about a year and has been replaced by the director of the CIA, right? So in counterpoint to this conventional genealogy, I analyze contemporary logistics as a transformation, perhaps a neoliberalization of routines of settler colonialism and settler capitalism in the US and beyond. The term that I'm going to talk about for the rest of this talk, settler capitalist logisticality, is meant to identify settler colonialism as a mode of transit for contemporary logistical capitalism. Following Chickasaw scholar Jodi Bird's use of the term transit, I suggest that repertoires of settler colonialism operationalize, are originary to, exemplify, and provide a medium for the movement and expansion of assemblages of logistical capitalism. Indeed, those of you who have read Bird's Transit of Empire know that its theorizations of movements of imperial planetarity that invoke Indianness for the operational ends of invasion heavily figures what I'm naming settler logisticality. My foregrounding of coloniality, the coloniality of logistics, aligns with a new thinking or a rethinking of capitalism as an irreducibly colonial formation with global inceptions. It emerges not through the nation state, but in and through hierarchical, uneven, and discontinuous colonial networks. The colonial character continues through states as colonial empires and settler states, then in and through our current neoliberal disaggregations of governance. So for me, the paradigmatic space of logistics is not the supply chain of contemporary capitalism, but the colonial supply line. As Cowan notes, quote, "It is not only striking but diagnostic that old enemies of empire, Indians and pirates, are among the groups that pose the biggest threats to the security of supply today. It is also incredibly revealing that these groups frame their struggle in explicitly anti-imperial terms. The resurfacing of the supply line at the center of contemporary geopolitical economy with the echoes of empire connects present war with past forms and indicts the era of national territory as the historical anomaly. I also want to say I'm indebted to David Lloyd and Patrick Wolf's 2015 essay. It's great, please read it, Settler Colonial Logics and the Neoliberal Regime. Here, citing how Israel's occupation of Palestine recapitulates earlier strategies of settler colonial domination in North America and Australasia, Lloyd and Wolf assert, quote, the necessity of grasping the importance of theorizing the formation and evolution of settler regimes in order to comprehend ongoing developments. They see settler regimes as still being relevant most fundamentally in the managing of surplus populations. And so quoting them again, it is in relation to the community of redundancy, we believe, that settler colonialism's inventory of local strategies is becoming increasingly congenial to neoliberalism's emergent order. So I think this is true, but I also think that their essay's strengths limit its insights. Their analysis of the present of Palestine through the past of European settler state expansion structures a historical narrative around the fact of the closure of the frontier. So in order to explain Israeli resistance to applying eliminatory strategies of assimilation to Palestinians, they posit that Israeli colonialism has not yet achieved a post-frontier moment, when presumably strategies of assimilatory elimination will replace war, removal, confinement, etc. From the point of view of logistics, however, the whole world is frontier, and it is never closed, but open for perpetual flexible settlement and unsettlement as it suits the purposes of targeted extractions, flows, and circulations. So while managing surplus populations is part of it, I argue that routines associated with settler state territorial expansion are also being remade with critical modifications, right? So settler logisticality today does not need large-scale physical settlement, right? It might just be logistical capital that's settling. And its processes of eliminating to replace are more targeted and much more temporally uncertain than state building. But rather than being in a post-frontier period, with Palestine being the exception, we might say that Palestine is integrated into a colonial state-building project, which indeed intends to annex all of the occupied Palestinian territories as soon as it can remove most Palestinians, and it's also integrated into localized global routines of perpetual settlement. And I'm thinking here of the industrial and agricultural zones that have annexed so much of the land of, so much of Area C in the West Bank. In perpetual flexible settlement, mobility remains key, and the figure Lloyd and Wolf identify as the mobile pioneer, which may now be logistical command and control, remains linked to its other, quote, the immobile, exterminated, dispossessed indigenous who, as Bird reminds us, representationally subtends the terrorist, and in particular now, the critical infrastructure terrorist. Have any of you heard those words before, critical infrastructure terrorist? It's a thing, okay. Watch out for it. I want to consider how settler capitalist logisticality transits strategies from what scholars call the period of the lethal interlude. So how extractive and logistical capitalism today are transmitting strategies from what we often think of as the period of the fatal interlude when we think about settler colonialism. And the fatal interlude is the time between theoretical conquest and actual conquest, between claims of discovery and ownership and the always incomplete establishment of settler state sovereignty. The lethal interlude is associated with kinds of colonial domination that operate through partial and segmented land appropriation, secured through ruthless violence and maintained through forced benevolent pacification of the surviving population. The strategies of the period of the lethal interlude work precisely because they are drawn out, because they establish control gradually, exploiting states of the external becoming internal, and of quasi-legality, such as squatters' rights and homesteading, which allow for a tactical versatility in claim-making. In the lethal interlude, lines between military, police, and private security entangle, luring legal and extra-legal violence to attain on the ground an authoritative ordering of space. So how might we think the operations of logistical capitalism as tending towards a kind of permanent lethal interlude? Its geographical coordinates might follow the pipelines of flow, which, to return to Cowan, are, quote, not only displacing the borders of national territory, but are also recasting geographies of law and violence that were organized by the inside-outside of state space. The quasi-legality of transnational logistics space relies on making claims through new or unsanctioned processes that are often the undoing of laws. Happy to talk about that in terms of Foxconn anytime. And logistical capitalism blurs military policing and private security up and down the pipeline of circulation and supply, expanding everywhere point-based security, outposts, checkpoints, fusion centers. Crucially, settler logisticality's lethal interlude, like settler colonialism itself, is a failed project. As Nicholas Brown writes, indigenous theory calls attention to a fundamental paradox whereby violence has not ended, yet invasion has not succeeded, signaling both the failure of settler colonialism as it highlights the continuous character of dispossession. So in my larger project, I turned to concrete examples of how native treaty camps, including Standing Rock, and Palestinian resistance, especially in Hebron and the southern Hebron Hills, expose settler logisticality from the point of view of ongoing circulations of native and Palestinian complex relationality. And I only have time to talk a little bit, very tentatively and very humbly, about Standing Rock. But first I want to just say a word about the boycotts associated with anti-colonial actions, these anti-colonial actions, because from the point of view of settler logisticality, you can really see why boycotts freak people out. Boycotts freak people out because they turn the geo-economic processes of logistical systems into vulnerabilities, showing them to be subject to decomposition, blockages at transfer points, and disruption. And they tend to a kind of co-resistance that strengthens alternative circulations of relationality. As Israeli scholar Eyal Weizman says, boycotts are like general strikes. You have to build relationships at the same time that you withdraw from other relationships. At its best, boycotts represent a collective affirmation that global capitalism remains rooted in social relationships, so it's neither abstracting nor self-regulating. At its very best, it can prefigure a globalizing of anti-oppression struggles waiting in the wings of history. The actions of energy transfer partners, the state of North Dakota, the Army Corps of Engineers, the private security company Tiger Swan, and the Obama and Trump administrations at Standing Rock demonstrate that the US state and settler capitalism remain in logistical war with native nations in the sense of trying to increase their own operational capacities while seeking to uproot or disable relations that sustain indigenous ones. In Fighting for Our Lives, #NoDAPL in historical context, Lower Brule Sioux scholar Nick Estes lets us see the occupation of Standing Rock treaty lands by ETP as part of the Indian Wars that have never ended, which the Lakota have fought always defensively to protect people, water, and land from, to quote Estes, spoliation in the name of profit, and which have been fought logistically by generations of what Estes calls fat takers. Colonial pre-state actors, established settler colonial state actors, and now unevenly privatized neoliberal settler state actors and kinds of colonial capitalisms. Estes makes visible long histories of logistical war as trespass, the trespass of settlers, the trespass of dams, the trespass of pipelines, as invasion with the Army Corps of Engineers playing a long and continuing role in this story, and as the forceful takeover of land through violence, corridors of occupation, fractionation, violated treaties, and the coercions of extractive industries. With ETP and DAPL, we see the latest circulation of settler accumulation being built on top of previous circulations, which for me is actually symbolized in the really hideous badge of the South Dakota State Highway Patrol, the badge that they wear. It's supposedly honoring, it's a settler history-produced legend that features a profile of Red Tomahawk, and the Highway Patrol are supposedly honoring him as a member of the BIA police force who shot and killed Sitting Bull. But this obscene badge, to me, reveals important continuities between genocidal violence of war for settlement, the coloniality of the policing of highways and the controlling of indigenous bodies through policing, and now the bundling of this colonial state highway patrol into this other thing, this fusion of extra-state militarized security forces acting on behalf of a global power. So to work against the singularity that colonial rationalities, including the ones inside of me, slot everything indigenous into in order to then sort it into good or bad forms, or complicit or resistant forms, I want to emphasize that Standing Rock is part of a whole context, right? It's not a singular thing synchronically or dichronically. Since contact, there's never not been a time when Native people were not working for survival and resurgence. And the more than 200 treaty camps blocking the desecrated intentions of extractive industries today connect to the treaty camps of the 1980s and 90s up in my neck of the woods, Anishinaabe spearfishing stands in the Midwest, and they connect much farther back and much more radically forward. I like the term treaty camp, not only because it vouchsafes the belonging with treaty lands, but it also brings up these older kind of places, right? The older notion of trading camps, winter camps, gatherings for diplomacy. From the mouth of the Cannonball River being known to tribal members as a powerful place of wakan, of gathering, praying, and honoring, down the generations to how the hundreds of Native nations who came together at Standing Rock in 2016 were actually renewing relations that in that very spot in 1974 had led to the founding of the International Indigenous Treaty Council. Tiger Swan at Standing Rock created a new assemblage of privatized violence that tried to organize all colonizer jurisdictions, highway police, state police, BIA, FBI, National Guard, all of them, under its authority on the basis of its superior logistical powers, its helicopters, manpower, military equipment, and infiltration. I have a few shots from their, I think you guys can see it well enough, right? From their website, right? Their motto is solutions to uncertainty. And as we see, their business plan involves framing mobility itself, the mobility that defines logistics and globalization as risks, seeing security challenges everywhere all the time, right? They promote themselves as a kind of powerful, all-powerful guardian angel for enterprise, for government, for families of the 1%, and for private, I think it means private individuals or whenever you need something to be private, right? So they're kind of selling themselves as a kind of privatized projection of US imperial power. US imperial power privatized, right? A supersession of Roosevelt's Rough Riders into a global protection force for hire. The investigative news site, The Intercept, acquired an amazing amount of insider information about Tiger Swan and published a series of troubling and illuminating articles. This is a daily intelligence update. I think they were able to get like hundreds of these, and they've published them all. They're worth checking out. Blurring legal and extra-legal violence, Tiger Swan was able to leverage law enforcement on behalf of ETP and to exercise all sorts of extra-legal policing and counterintelligence operations because after 9/11, critical infrastructure, something like, I have it written down, 85% of which is owned by private people, has been called a national security issue, right? Trump just tried to say that steel tariffs were a national security issue, which connects to this whole thing. Tiger Swan was able to embed itself into South Dakota's fusion center and at least 4 other fusion centers, which are these centers that were started after 9/11 so that anti-terrorism intelligence could be shared among state, local, and federal law agencies. But Tiger Swan, this private company, actually took a coordinating role, not only in North Dakota, but in many, many other states where there seemed to be protests or problems with the pipeline. One Tiger Swan internal situation report from 10/30/16 shows that Tiger Swan met with campus police at the University of Illinois Springfield to see what they knew about protests and to see if they would be amenable to setting up one of these fusion centers and sharing information with this private security company. They thought part of their job indeed was to pressure law enforcement to be more suppressive to demonstrators. In one situation report, they applauded the fact that in Lee County, Iowa, bail was raised for demonstrators, and in the same report, they complained about a too lax attitude of law enforcement elsewhere. Quote, Calhoun, Boone, and Webster County law enforcement are not supportive of DAPL's security mission. We need to work closer with them to ensure future protesters will be fined, if not arrested. So from the very beginning, their approach was completely militarized. We learn from their shared daily intelligence reports that Tiger Swan helicopters provided live feed that was watched in real time by observers from the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, the BIA, state and local police, and is now being used by state prosecutors as evidence in trials against water protectors. And this was, again, the intention from the very beginning, right? In their reports, they talk about that their responsibilities include collecting information of an evidentiary level, that would ultimately aid in prosecution of protesters. Indeed, they determined surveillance and counterintelligence to be a big part of their job, and intelligence, as we see, was a category on their daily situation report. Reading between the lines, it's clear to see they have people on the ground, posing as protectors, trying to exploit divisions within the camps, which are described as dangerous, full of weapons, and organized like militant encampments. You see they have a part that says, like, what we do not know, number and type of weapons in camp, who is providing military training, when and where the next event will occur, and how many rioters will attend, have not confirmed command and control at events, suspect Cody Hall, right? Okay, and you see they're trying to exploit, there's the third line down, it says there are divisions within the camps, i.e. natives versus whites, and intertribal conflicts. There are outsiders deliberately moving the rioters towards violent action, et cetera, right? They really did all the time refer to water protectors as terrorists, camps as battlefields. And in one internal report, they use the find, fix, and finish language that the special ops uses to talk about terrorist targets in a promise to ETP that they would find enough intelligence that ETP could find, fix, and eliminate public pipeline threats. One report from 9/22 targeted Palestinians in the camp, especially Palestinian American activist Haitham El-Zabri, and it stated, quote, the presence of additional Palestinians in the camp and the movement's involvement with Islamic individuals is a dynamic that requires further investigation. Today, Tiger Swan is aiding extractive industries and state-level Republicans in lawfare, including the creation of legislation which seeks to create new legal subjects, criminalizing resistors as critical infrastructure terrorists, right, which is a formation like black identity terrorist, right? New crimes in the forms of anti-direct action obstruction bills, like making obstructing a roadway, like protesting closing down a roadway, a felony crime, obstructing business, economic terrorism, and the work of journalism and obstruction of government functions. So even as settler projects pile on top of one another, and today's settler logisticality transits yesterday's fatal interlude, eliminatory settler colonialism remains a failure. We see over and over again what Mushwana Goman calls the inability to bind land to settler societies. We get a sense of the ongoing continuity of Lakota circulations from the testimony one architect gave, from the Standing Rock Nation gave in the form of a story of his own life. Quote, we would stop and our grandmother, who was born in 1881, would have us go up to the nearby hills to the west, not far from the old wagon trail, and take food to the spirits of our relatives. Since childhood, I have been aware of the many buried in this area, stretching north and northwest of one of DAPL's proposed access roads. Arguably, the prayers and ceremonies of treaty camp actions can be seen as related to this ongoing consideration for ancestors. At Standing Rock, other treaty camps, like in the West Bank, co-resistance importantly takes the shape of guest-host relations, inviting, welcoming, thanking, gifting, explaining, asking permission, telling stories that transmit land-based knowledges under conditions where, to use the Palestinian expression, existence is resistance, and to use the expression from Leanne Simpson, where our presence is our weapon. Setting up normal circulations of life, kitchens, building roads, putting up tents, making up meeting places, bespeaks pre-existing circulations that know and treat land and collective existence otherwise. To quote Nick Estes, the prolonged peaceful encampment practices an unsettling counter-sovereignty. Mushwana Goman writes, Native people's stories of land, whether violent or from time immemorial, move us beyond the abstract state rendering of space as territory or property. And so I want to end by looking at part of a story by Leanne Simpson from which I'm trying to learn. And part of my learning has been to read this story and to work on the pronunciations of the Anishinaabe, which I'm still going to get wrong, with my good friend and the very generous poet, scholar, and Anishinaabemowin language teacher, Professor Margaret Ann Newton at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So in that event of reading together, Professor Newton opened up my reading of the story as an anti-treaty that figures a prayer to repair and to negate the abuse and pollution of the Otanabe River and all the beings related to it. That is, my reading of it as a representation of an anti-treaty that negates and portends the undoing of everything I've been talking about as settler capitalist logisticality. And I'm not going to speak in her place, except to express gratitude for what she sort of helped me understand sort of beyond the text and my first hearing of it, some possibilities for hearing the water speak with its own voice, and for thinking not so much the rebuttal of hierarchical relations as what she called no-archical relations, all right? So that's impossible for you to read, right? Very hard to read, but at least you can see a little bit of the formatting of it. And I'm going to read you some of it now. She is the only doorway into this world. Roman numeral 1. It is with great regret that we are writing on behalf of the Michi-Sagik Anishinabeg to inform you that you will not be permitted to build your lift, locks, canals, and hydro dams here because this is the place where we come to sit and talk with our Anikubi Ganik. Article 2. It is with great regret that we are writing on behalf of the Michi-Sagik Ashnabeg to inform you that you will not be permitted to build your lift, locks, canals, and hydro dams because these are the rivers we use to travel Chenabish to Wasagama. These routes are vital to the health and well-being of our relatives, Pimi Ziwak, eel, and Majamigosik, salmon. 3. It is with great regret that we are writing on behalf of the Michi-Sagik Ashnabeg that you will not be permitted to build your lift, locks, canals, and hydro dams because we cannot permit concrete shackles on our mother. She needs to be free to move around in order to cleanse and give birth. 4. It is with great regret that we are writing on behalf of the Michi-Sagik Ashnabeg to inform you that you will not be permitted to build your lifts, locks, canals, and hydro dams because the fish, eels, birds, insects, plants, turtles, and reptiles do not consent to the damage your project will cause. 5. It is with great regret that we are writing on behalf of the Michi-Sagik Anishinabeg to inform you that you will not be permitted to build your lifts, locks, canals, and hydro dams because the caribou, elk, deer, bison, lynxes, fox, wolves, wolverines, martens, otters, muskrats, bears, skunks, raccoons, beavers, squirrels, chipmunks do not consent to the damage your project will cause. And then I'm sort of skipping down to the last line. Signed this 21st day of June, 1830, Nogajiwanog, Kina Gichi Ashnabeg Ogaming. Kanagana, Wenona, X her mark. Gijigokwe, Sky Woman, her mark. Nimki Benesekwe, X. Nokomis, grandmother, X. Ogedicha kwe jijak dodam. So Ogedicha, Ogichida, I got it. Ogichida, like a respected or holy person. Kwe makes it female, makes it a woman. Ogichida kwe jijak, crane. Dodam, from the root word to be responsible to, clan. Ogichida kwe migize, bald eagle, dodam, her mark. Ogichida kwe adik, caribou, dodam, her mark. Thank you.
I'd like to invite my colleague, Jodi Melamed, to give the response to the wonderful book by Jodi Melamed. Thank you so much. Mimi, as you all know, is Associate Professor of Gender and Women's Studies and Asian American Studies here. She's currently Interim Chair of Gender and Women's Studies. And her first book is called The Gift of Freedom, War, Death, and Other Refugee Passages. The book focuses on the promise of giving freedom, concurrent and contingent aid waging war. Her following project is called The Promise of Beauty. She has published numerous articles in Science, Camera Obscura, Women in Performance, Positions, and Radical History Review. She has been a Conrad Professorial Scholar and is now the Nicholson Professorial Scholar here at Illinois. Her papers have been solicited for the Feminist Theory Archive at Brown University. Please welcome Mimi.
Can I close this? Oh, yeah. Sorry. It's okay. All right. So I want to thank Susan for asking me to do this response and to Jodi for so generously sharing with me earlier drafts of this work. I had so many thoughts while reading these earlier drafts of Jodi Melamed's talk, The Open Secret of Racial Capitalist Violence. Some of these earlier thoughts being abolish the police, and also, I'm a pretty loud talker. Okay. And also, I love black blocs. That refers to a part that got cut out. However, I'm going to respond to two insights from Melamed's rich engagement with the concept of managerial administrative violence. The first insight comes from what she talks about as settler capitalist logisticality. As she illuminates so well, the unimpeded flow of racial capital necessitates multiple forms of violence, and a variety of agencies are recruited here, including highway patrols, corporate mercenaries, intelligence agencies, legislatures, and we might add data miners and data brokers, among others, because as we know, Facebook was hugely responsible for a lot of the tracking activities, and of course, they are tracking us all now, right now. In order to ensure command and control of those flows and to criminalize others. In doing so, settler capitalist logisticality claims the whole planet for its jurisdiction, quote, subtended by intense paranoia and militarism. As such, every flow must be securitized through borders, gateways, zones, and corridors in order to continually safeguard comprehensive infrastructures of accumulation and, quote unquote, ownership. Towards these ends, Melamed elaborates upon these geoeconomic strategies, including the collaborations between agencies of legal and extra-legal violence at Standing Rock, marshaling local and federal law enforcement and counterintelligence operations, as well as private security firms to protect privately owned, quote-unquote, critical infrastructure in the name of national security. And Tiger Swan, known for conducting counter-terror operations overseas, described water protectors as, quote, generally following the jihadist insurgency model also. So these forces are also cooperating to create new categories of crime and criminality to prosecute political protesters. So since Black Lives Matter and Standing Rock, at least 60 measures have been proposed and a handful approved, as Jodi points out, to expand the definitions of criminal trespass, raise the penalty for a riot conviction, classify the obstruction of traffic or railways as a felony, restrict public assembly on public land and schools, protect drivers who unintentionally hit protesters with their cars, and punish journalists. So I found her talk really generative for thinking about these campaigns as concurrent with what we're also seeing unfolding as an intensive deportation and detention and deportation regime, funneling humans into an archipelago of private prisons, the authorization of ICE along a 100-mile zone contingent with the US border, with Canada and Mexico, so pretty much I think only Iowa and Illinois are not within this zone. Have you seen that map? Repeated anti-Muslim travel bans, which also heightened our security theater at all points of crossing, and anti-trafficking measures masquerading as moral crusades. These are all aimed at creating new categories of crime and criminality to further control the movements of bodies and capital. And our colleagues Naomi Pike and Lisa Cacho, who's here, could speak at length about the first three. And I'm going to focus for a hot second on anti-trafficking measures in order to consider this as another example of racial capitalist violence in a humanitarian voice, which are anti-trafficking measures are often described as this kind of new abolition by its proponents to fight quote-unquote modern-day slavery, which of course do nothing to address structural impoverishment or governmental debt, to say nothing of the fact that the new abolitionists hail from those states for which human trafficking laid the foundations of racial capitalism, to instead criminalize the movements of those who perform illicit labor. Or as Sarah Hunt writes about the Canadian state discourse of trafficking of Indigenous girls and women, quote, trafficking discourses largely draw attention away from the role of the state in colonial violence toward Indigenous peoples and instead appeal to the state for a more powerful legal response to trafficking, end quote. And so this last year or more, we've seen a lot of an uptick in this kind of criminalization of sex work as a part of this effort to quote-unquote combat human trafficking, which includes the raids by the New Orleans Police Department and the Louisiana Alcohol and Tobacco Control and the Louisiana State Police on strip clubs on Bourbon Street in late January, ostensibly to combat human trafficking, but leaving hundreds of dancers without work right before Mardi Gras. And the raids are a part of a mayoral effort with the aid of developers and a chain of nonprofit Catholic-affiliated homeless shelters to gentrify the red light district into a more family-friendly destination. Also passed in the last few weeks with strong bipartisan support, FOSTA and SESTA, which are Fight Online Sex Trafficking and Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers, are congressional bills that amend federal law to hold websites criminally responsible if they assist or facilitate in sex trafficking. What unfolds through FOSTA and SESTA and other anti-trafficking acts is both border control then, and also the attenuation of livable spaces for sex workers' autonomy. So, for instance, without being able to screen clients and create a paper trail, FOSTA and SESTA and other anti-trafficking acts is going to push sex workers into more dangerous street work, increasing police harassment and violence, including theft and rape, and further criminalizing trans and queer people of color, persons who live in neighborhoods designated as quote-unquote high crime, and who are then profiled as quote-unquote doing sex work, right? So it's not rescue if you're incarcerated and then deported. These measures flatten distinctions between trafficking and migration and trafficking and sex work while doing nothing to address the violence of racial capital. Consider the first anti-immigration act in the United States, the Page Act of 1875, which prohibited the migration of all Chinese women for probable prostitution, or the Palermo Protocols adopted by the United Nations to supplement the 2000 Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which bundles human trafficking with illegal arms trading as criminal concerns rather than as labor rights. Thus, like deportations and travel bans, anti-trafficking measures also augment administrative powers while also facilitating the militarization of the police and the authorization of other legal and extra-legal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security, ICE, NGO, state and state-sponsored paramilitaries in some states like Thailand, and also international Christian evangelical organizations with surveillance and other kinds of police powers. It is on this note that with settler capitalist logisticality comes the intensification and proliferation of power and violence, as Jodi points out so well, that I want to turn to the idea of the lethal interlude, or quote, from the talk, the time between theoretical conquest and actual conquest, between claims of discovery and ownership, and the always incomplete and resisted establishment of settler state sovereignty. In this lethal interlude, Melamed observes the entanglements of, quote, legal and extra-legal violence flexibly attain on the ground an authoritative political, social, and economic ordering of space, because this rule of law or capital and their coupling is a failed project that continually needs to reinforce itself. But so I'm interested in this idea of it as a failed project because I'm not quite sure that failure is what it is. In the present, we find that as states and some empires concede the impossibility of achievable security, resilience and risk are paired concepts building crisis into the administration of life, proposing that unforeseeable and likely inevitable disruptions are a quote-unquote new normal, and promising the intensifications of our capacities to adapt to this disturbing order. We know well that the indeterminacy of terror became the motor for the preemptive exercises of war powers, but also for their expansion, which of course we face on new fronts with the appointment of John Bolton to National Security Advisor. I observe this because if risk to, say, something like critical infrastructure is rendered as pure potential and realizable at any coming moment, then risk becomes a continuous state, a permanent and pervasive crisis saturating all aspects of life, requiring more and more administrative governance. So I'm thinking here of the last preemptive wars launched during the Bush administration in those places, Afghanistan and Iraq, to which the United States military forces and private mercenaries promised freedom. Transition, like interlude, a pause, is the assurance that U.S. forces will usurp illegitimate powers for a brief time, and following this timetable, a timetable for occupation will bring an end to its own rule, right? So you'll transition to someone else's self-government. Transition is deeply logistical. It produces and is produced by socio-technical assemblages and management systems for identification, assessment, and mitigation. Constant regulation and surveillance regimes are put into place to account for the transition objectives, target strengths, and predictive estimates of return. Understood in this way, transition belongs to a calculative infrastructure that borrows from colonial measures and accelerates, rescales, and refines these measures with new instruments. At the same time, as the NATO Secretary General cautioned in 2010, quote, "We need to be clear about what transition means and doesn't mean. Transition means that Afghan authorities take the lead and we move into a supportive role, but it doesn't mean a rush for the exit," right? So transition is sold as this idea that it'll last for a moment of time, but then it will end. But clearly it will not, because we're still there. Indeed, last July, Eric D. Prince, founder of the private military company Blackwater Worldwide, at the request of Steve Bannon, Trump's then chief strategist, and Jared Kushner, his senior advisor and son-in-law, submitted a proposal that the war in Afghanistan be handed over entirely to a mercenary fighting force led by a viceroy who would report directly to Trump. And he actually cites the British East India Company, a private company that was the instrument of British colonialism for centuries, as a model here. In the meanwhile, more and more permanent bases have been built in Afghanistan as command posts for drone strikes across Pakistan's borders. So perhaps it is not that settler capitalist logisticality aims to end the lethal interlude and conquer all risk to its operations. As Melamed has illuminated so well, the failure of the interlude to end because risk, whether to critical infrastructure, to capital mobility, to military adventures, is ever present, inevitable, and very profitable, as we see from the Tiger Swan website. The failure of the interlude to end because of risk is the reason for the intensification, and because it's ever present and inevitable, it then becomes the reason for the intensification and proliferation of lethal forms. And so perhaps this is not a failure at all, but the aim. And that's what I got. Thanks.
Thank you, that was great. Thank you, Mimi. We're gonna stay here together.
Okay, yeah.
Do I hold this up between us?
Maybe we can
hold it between you.
Sorry, people who are watching at home. Putting the mic down right now.
You can actually come in front if you feel more comfortable instead of having this barrier.
Okay. So big, and you're so short.
Okay. Yeah.
No, I really, that's such a great, there's so much I want to think about more with you. I have a copy of that, and I'd like to think about it more. But yes, the permanent lethal interlude is supposed to stay there, right? I mean, it's like the peace process in Israel-Palestine, right? So yeah, that's part of the strategy. But I do think it's also important to remember that it can't complete itself because it always needs to be and completely squish everything else out. And it also makes me think of like how crazy this stuff is. That one of them was we were talking about Bannon. So Bannon, do you guys remember this? He started a whole campaign against the administrative state. Right? It's like, what is Bannon doing a critique of administrative violence? This is what. But of course, he's just very good at reversals, right? So what he wanted to do was make it so that the state could do, in effect, nothing. So that capital, right, the forces of privatized capital could do everything. And what he wanted, and what Gorsuch is a fan of, is that anything the government is to do, like test a drug, make sure a drug is safe, a law has to be written. So the FDA can't do its area of expertise, right? The NEH can't do its area of expertise. The Department of Defense, that's probably different. But like, you literally have to have Congress say, this drug should be tested. Otherwise, get rid of the FDA and let people do what they want. You know what I mean? So it's this way of making it sound like you're critiquing administrative violence when you're actually making it
more possible for capitalist managers to have more administrative power, and taking anything that's like people acting collectively together in the name of the public good and making it harder to do. Like, it's really, I think this is, do you guys feel, I'd love to hear it, I don't want to talk too much because I want to hear from you guys, but like, I feel that this is a time where this is really leaping ahead, right? Like, so in Milwaukee where I live, a law has been passed. There are all these laws that are about rights not to have, like, you cannot even think about other people, right? So like, there's a law passed that says if in the state of, if a municipality like the city of Milwaukee passes a living wage law or an anti-discrimination law that is more strict than state law, those people who pass the law, the city council and the mayor, will go to jail. The jail is the punishment for passing a living wage ordinance, right? So on the one hand, right, like
Wasn't that also North Carolina or South Carolina?
I think it's in the ALIC. Yeah. It's in the ALIC package, the research, the consortium network thing. So it's going to all the states. Totally. And I really liked your part also about the humanitarianism around the anti-trafficking, because there's continuity between the era of Obama, neoliberal multiculturalism, I think of as neoliberal multiculturalism, and this, which I think of as sort of an authoritarian, ethno-nationalist sort of capitalism. And the authoritarian is the key here, because I see it as like authoritarian everywhere, right? And yet the humanitarianism can easily transfer from that era to this era, right? Which I think with your work on refugees and the passivity of the person targeted by that discourse, you really see why it can transfer. And it's surprising it can transfer, but you can really see why it does. Yeah, so thank you for that work.
Okay.
I understand how, thank you so much for your talk. I understand how the concept of settler capitalist logisticality applies to the United States, but I'm wondering how you synthesize it with Israel, considering how it has been started or founded and continues to advertise itself as a socialist haven, and because of how, settlements, early settlements before the formation of the actual state were actually modeled after co-ops in Ireland and so I'm just wondering how, because they continue to see themselves, especially since they offer citizenship with money, with housing, with all of these things that are not in any way capitalist.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I really see Palestine as being subject to 2 rounds of settler accumulation, not just in one, right? I see the settler colonial state building project, right, as bringing people in, financing them to come in, creating the numbers, you know what I mean? A state finance project of eliminating to replace, bringing in the replacements, right? That's really the dynamic on the ground, right? But also, I do think also it's more and more also a part of the second round of accumulation, where you have those huge, even within Israeli society, the huge gap between like the oligarchs who own everything, right, and the Mizrahi who get subsidized, you know what I mean? And yet that capitalist dynamic is there. And I also think you see more and more people taking advantage of the agricultural zones and the industrial zones, and coming in and making, like, this is why the labeling settlement goods, right, is such an issue, because people are getting rich off of annexing land in the Area C. And it serves 2 purposes, right? It's making someone, and sometimes they're Palestinian capitalists, right, but usually they're Israeli capitalists, right? It's making somebody very, very, very rich, and it's taking the land away from folks in Area C who used it, right, from Palestinians. So I do think it's in 2, but I hear the criticism, and I want to think more about it, how capitalism is overshadowing the colonialism part of it. You know what I mean? I kind of hear that in your criticism, and I think that's a legitimate criticism, and I want to think more about that.
Yeah, and sorry.
No.
Like, and the only reason, and one of the reasons why I'm asking about it is because you started off by talking about Marx, right? And Marx's critique of capitalism has actually been used also by urban scientists. So I'm just like, I guess my question is not about necessarily like the reality on the grounds, but like as a dissertation graduate student, how do you theoretically or philosophically reconcile Marx as a critic of capitalism with how he has been co-opted by
And I like that sort of sense that like there is a you know there is a relation, right? You know what I mean? Like he can be heard in that way.
Yeah.
And I mean, Marx, you know, it's kind of an easy one in terms of his like love of modernity and the whole like new Jew and progress will get you there. You know what I mean? But I hear you saying that, you know, it needs to be, the whole project needs to be kind of rethought and reconceptualized in its specificity for the Palestine situation a little bit more. I'm getting there. It's very early, but now I'm like, oh good, I'm going to go and do some work like that, and I'll do a different talk, and I'll focus on Hebron and the southern Hebron Hills, and then we'll talk. Are you? Okay, I would love to talk. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm always like, and I may be a cynical kind of almost academic, but I always want to focus on like, all right, so what can we do? And you know, and I think you just talked about like, you know, this capitalistic managerialistic style that, you know, that Bannon is trying to like, you know, push into us. But you know, as I see, how can we as academics or, you know, at a university level do something about it when that kind of style is creeping into how business is done at the university?
That's a good question. Mimi, you chime in anytime. I mean, especially because I do think the university is a laboratory. You know what I mean? I think the more that they can tell you that all rights mean is that you have to stay in your free speech zone and like let the right wing take over and talk more and like don't fund universities, you know what I mean? So that there's austerity and then the privatized money means more and more. Like if you read like Jane Meyer's Bright Money, the 5,000 scholars who've been you know, financed through that network, and Madison just got like a new like represent conservative thought sort of thing, and they're really trying, and I think like folks are committed to things like free speech or, you know, individual freedoms get confused, right? This is where you have to go outside of the liberal framework. They get confused. They're like, we like free speech, we like individual rights, you know, we like, you know, that kind of, and I think that universities have to be smart enough, right, to say like, just like what you're calling freedom is going to take, you know, is like the opposite of it. Like call it its bizarro thing, right? So writing, thinking, doing, I mean, what you really find out, right, is like none of this administrative brouhaha can hold up to any kind of context, right? You put some history in it, you move it around, whether it's Standing Rock, you know what I mean, or whether it's, you know, the idea that Nazis should have free speech because, you know, if you think about free speech as like whose speech actually counts and, you know, that sort of thing, then it makes a big difference. So knowing that context, teaching that context, talking that context, and then just getting out of the university too, right? That's the other problem, is that you can't fetishize the hierarchy of knowledge produced in the universities. You know, the revolution will not get in syllabus, right? Here, you know, like love it, but then not fetishize it seems like super important, right? Connecting to those other rhythms seem super, super critical. And there's something almost in my mind to say, but it's not there. So anyway, thank you for that question. It's a really big question. Questions for Mimi? Do you guys can I get feedback then? Like strengths and weaknesses? Convincing, most convincing, least convincing? Should I have like something with things? Yeah, 1 through 10? Or just anything, you know, that you thought needed a little more development or you saw differently, like that was super helpful? Yeah. I want to ask a question related to the last one. I kind of want to push it a little more. But I'm good at doing that.
I was kind of thinking the same thing, because the project, a lot of the project is about critiquing the logic that makes everything so totalizing. And I was kind of wanting a little bit more examples of the vulnerabilities, right? Because that's, like you gave the example of the boycott, for instance. I'm thinking, right, are there other examples where something that becomes so totalizing is also at the same time so vulnerable? Or because I think in general, just all of us, like when we are writing and teaching this kind of work, we maybe don't
Shabani Forest,
Yeah, the Melamed Forest and the nation, right? Like
Yeah.
that's like such huge, important resistance to
Yeah.
like be terminated and then it just exists anyway. Like it shows so many things, right? But it's like, you know, like I kind of want more trees.
I mean, that's the thing that's kind of hard, right? And they're like more trees. Okay, I'll find you some I mean, there was also a little bit of the Leanne Simpson, right? I mean, that's the deal, right? It's all an as if, right? It's all a lie. And nobody, like none of us are just property. All we want to do is, you know, relate to each other as other owners of property, and we all vote in our, you know what I mean? Like the idea of the human that we get, you know, is so small, and we're all so much more than that all the time, right? We all are anti-capitalist to the core all the time, right? Like somebody is gonna feed, you know, somebody held the door open for me, somebody, you know, like went out of their way to kind of help me when I wanted to cry. You know what I mean? Like we just don't act according to these neoliberal logics in reality. But but when we start to judge ourselves by them more and more, like we get bought into the idea of like, I must be an entrepreneurial subject, I must be a fan of human capitalism, right? Like structures make it really hard to think that, but then we need the bases, and to make them really stronger, to not think of ourselves that way. And so like part of my learning, and I feel really grateful that crazy academic, whatever you go, you get the job, you go there, right, brought me to Indian country, right? Wisconsin has many nations and many folks, and Milwaukee's a big urban Indian country place. I've learned a lot. Like I've learned things like, you know, you have to, like, you're not a big part of this, you know, like really like the water will, you know, communicate with the cloud, and the cloud, you know what I mean? Like really like a non-human centric universe, right? And it's been really kind of helpful to think in some of those big scales. My friend Meg Newton, who I shared that she helped me with some of the Anishinaabe, she wrote a poem, and this poem is sort of, she considered it as a decolonial poem, and it's remembering a time when this guy who's like, I think if you went to Michigan, you'd hear about him, and he was like a really great explorer. And it's written from the point of view of like the animals who were around him, and like how they kind of attacked him a little, and how they saw him, and like, you know, sort of eating extra food because they're getting ready to like get through it. And I really like, I mean, it sounds like a story, right? But it's a really hopeful story. It's a really reversal story, and it's really like, it's like, how do we learn how to really let the land be agential, really let water be agential, like really respect and take, you know, sort of, and even that idea of protector is still a patriarchal, paternal idea, right? It's like the water doesn't, you know, who are we to protect water, you know? Yeah, so there, I think it's one of those, like, I've been thinking a lot about, like, so you kind of put your finger on something like the realization effect of like these projections of power, and we come to believe them, and they take up a lot of space, and that people are going to jail. Well, nobody's going to jail. You know what I mean? Like everybody, there's a lot of legal stuff going on. Those laws have not been passing, right? But it's its own projection, right? So you have to step outside of it as much as you can and build the other story, and even while you understand it really well. And I wish there was a way to kind of, maybe like we should present differently, and like I should have been like, Tiger Swan, you know, like, here's the Tiger, here's the Swan. You know what I mean? Like I should have made more fun of them, because they are pretty funny. They're like these dudes. Like we're you know, like they just, I can't even tell you stories about them and the idiotic things that their agents did. And they were really dopey. A lot of what they did was really dopey, and I can't believe they got paid as much money as they did.
But here's where the guest host framework does interesting work too,
Yeah.
right? In relationship to thinking about the not finished project or the failed project of ongoing settler colonialism, because you can remove every tribe from a space, and Illinois is a story of that, but it doesn't change the fact that the laws of this place are still in action. That's what Kwakwakiwak scholar Sarah Hunt would tell us in her work, is that you know, towards this sensibility around the agential water. That what it really means to say water is life, and this is one of those things that I think people don't understand grammar, and this is one of those things that, you know, translations out of indigenous languages back into English, but it's not that, you know, I think people think that water is something necessary for life is the meaning of that, and actually it's saying water just is life, right? And that's where the capitalist, that's where the colonialist frameworks start to take over and reframe, and that's what we have to do from the other side, to keep reminding that these logics are what we concede to, right, and not use it.
I like that, right? The conceding to the framing of meanings. I have to go back to that question. Yeah.
I think I'm curious about, I've been sitting here, so I'm not sure that I have my thoughts fully together, but I'm thinking a lot about the way that I heard in your discussion how Black Lives Matter sort of was this echo, right, or sort of thinking about that, but I'm not sure. I would be interested in more ways that the Black body as commodification, right, as always already an object, right, within this space. What does that mean in relationship to this administrative managerial project, right?
Yeah.
Rather than me hearing it as just sort of like an echo, I recognize these things happening. Here's bodies where this thing has taken a particular formation all along, right? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, deep histories of racial capitalism, folks will say, right, that all of our modernity depends on making the Black body and Black bodies in general subject to killing, to letting die, to commodification, to property, right? So that capitalism can always go back to that violence, right? And target those people, you know what I mean? And then keep everybody else in line in certain ways. I do think that Black Lives Matter has also been fighting against, like, some of this settler capitalist logisticality, right? Taking over streets, don't shop, you know what I mean? Like the entire history of, as I read it, right? And humbly here, right? Of like a lot of the emphasis of Black liberation, Black freedom struggles of the 21st century has been anti-capitalist to the core, right? Because it's been not property rights, it's like Black lives, not, you know, like when we see it again and again. And so I think that impulse fits in with this talk a lot. Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that question. And I think that, and to me that, sorry, I'm like, what? But it's noticing, right? Like again, how do we don't get like to the totalizing question, right? It's like everybody's doing this all at once, right? Everybody's out on the streets blocking streets. Right? The blockades everywhere, like not letting things go on as usual. All the strategies to expose violence as usual rather than just the normal framework of events, right? So I think that it really does, like the way people are connecting Ferguson to Palestine to Standing Rock, right? It really, like that is a very, very powerful connecting of struggles, right? That are all against this kind of, you know, ultra-capitalist move, right? And I think as the terms through which capital circulates gets more and more authoritarian, where, you know, if you touch a pipeline anywhere, right, people want to call you a terrorist now, that the importance of the livingness that people organize for themselves outside of those states that are passing these or trying to pass these authoritarian laws is super important. Thoughts? Yes.
I'd be curious to what your analysis and framing suggests about the lack, perhaps lack is not the correct word, but the inability of alternative structures to effectively compete in this context where the broad colonial project is kind of like overwhelming everything. What does your analysis offer any insights beyond the deeper understanding to the implications for alternatives that allows them, that positions them, that helps them organize themselves in ways that bring to the conversation equally persuasive strategy, vision, tactics, and those kinds of things?
I mean, I think I didn't frame things very well, because I think what I really wanted to bring out of a lot of this was that we did see, and we everywhere see, those alternatives, right? And I really wanted to talk about them as indigenous-led, right, and Palestinian-led in that context, right, where people are learning new ways of thinking, being, and doing from Native leaders, you know, and Native folks, and going to treaty camps and learning, and you know, there's some pretty powerful things I think happening, and the discourse is changing, right? So I didn't mean to sort of talk about no alternative. I really wanted it to kind of give a sense of an alternative kind of relationality, right? Where I don't relate to you as a fellow citizen or just a student or something like that, right? But as someone who is, you know, with me in this place. And really, though, thinking back to what Jodi Berg was talking about, the kind of guest-host relationships, right, that are being enacted, right, through some of these in the treaty camps, but just in general, right, between Native folks and settlers, and you know,
Would you characterize those? The trouble I'm having is characterizing those movements, which I also see as powerful and valuable as on any par, kind of winning the argument.
I mean, I guess it depends who you're listening to, right? I mean, I don't know. I can't. It's not to me, it's not a football game. You know what I mean? Where I can have a score, one side or the other, right? You see things shifting, right? You see like 18 indigenous women running for office. That's a measure, right? In Montana, right? But you see shifting in how people, who they're responsive to, who they feel responsible to, what they're willing to do, what they're willing to think. You know. That's probably the best I can put it right now, but I'll keep thinking about it. Yeah.
So thanks for both of you for a lot to think about. I think that's sort of the slowness in response, but just to sort of push the question here also.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that I love what you did sort of with the logisticality and some, or the formations of it. But then, does this question of struggle, this alternative, this other sort of ideas of epistemology and ontology, does that actually require you to change your theories? That's, I guess, one of the ways to think about this. And sort of, I think for those of us who are theoretically engaged with these questions, we've often, like, we're huge beneficiaries of the kind of theorization you've already done. But then the question is, like, well, how do we think about that idea of, okay, if there is this modality that we can push forward in terms of indigenous critique, it comes back to what was coming earlier, even that question of, like, Marx is already saying some of that stuff, but not saying that stuff, right? So what would how does that sort of shift your orientation?
No, it's interesting. It's a great question for me to think about more, but I do think that we need to emphasize, this is maybe teaching me, that I need to emphasize a bit more the as-if feint of administrative power, the kind of as-if part of it. Like, let's look at, you know, it's hard because you don't want to, the as-if is very violent, right? It's laundering, you don't want to be like, you know, I mean, the as-if of the census, right? Didn't Trump today impose that he wants people on the census to say whether or not they're citizens, and like we all know that this is so that they can gerrymander or, you know, get less money going to places where people don't identify because they don't want to be marked down as non-citizen, or there's many other things that could happen with that, right? But the impulse behind it is like a very, very dark necro-political one, right? Like, if you're not a citizen, you shouldn't be here, you shouldn't you don't count, you literally should not be counted, right? But, you know, it's a very violent as-if, but like as if that, like, people aren't part of these, you know, as if people aren't already in community, already with each other, aren't gonna like find food and take care of each other in some way, and, you know, create like living worlds of care. I mean, that's the thing, right? We like women, you know what I mean? Like look at Milwaukee, right? Milwaukee never has gotten any money from anybody, right? The state has always hated the city has always found ways to keep alive, and yet it's still violent and hard. You know what I mean? The violence is really real. But so maybe instead of like having the like letting it like represent itself in its martial, because it does, it wants to like intimidate, logistics wants to intimidate. Maybe instead of giving logistics fantasy of itself, I need to find a presentation style which is not native to me, right, and not the one that I'm not used to, that lets me put more quotations around this as if and use some of the, you know, something, I mean, I tried to do a little counterpoint with like the Simpson reading, right, which is really like, there never was a treaty, you know, and it's like this sort of like, we regret to inform you, sort of parodying on the resignation letter, right, I regret to inform you I'm going to be leaving, like just sort of pulling away, right, so there's sort of this way in which that the pretensions of the settler state have never taken the river there, right? She uses the name the Otonabee River, which is actually a Haudenosaunee name. And so there's some history there about Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wyandot history there that's important kind of, I think, to her story. But river's there, you know what I mean? So maybe I need to develop like as if, the as if of administrative power a little bit more. Help me do that. Send me an email. I'm going to send you my talk. And if you could find places where you could like, put the quotes here, you know what I mean? That would be awesome. Yeah.
Well, I'm just going to say, put like cartoon music over that video.
That would be good, right? That would be good. Or play both ways, you know what I mean? Play some like tripod red. Yeah.
So I have a question really similar to this. These sort of residuals that exist outside of the totality of capitalism or
presumptions, yeah,
right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there's these relationships that are always residual and that always will be, that don't operate on capitalist or colonial logics, right? Mm-hmm. That we share with each other. Mm-hmm. How do we get that to influence the relations of production or relationships of land, mm-hmm, or relationships of, like how do we transfer that, those relationships to, I guess, make them institutionalized, I guess.
I mean, a good historical Marxist would say you can't plan it in advance, right, without guarantee. It's without guarantees, and you have to like do everything all the time, you know, and then they would say like riot and strike. But I do think the more thinking we do and relating with each other we do outside of that, and not in these like, I'm not into like the like timeshare economy where I'll work for you for 4 hours, you know what I mean? But really like recognizing that we do that all the time already. You know what I mean? Somebody asked me a question, and I don't know what you guys think about this, but I'd love to see what you guys think. They were like, well, what would you do? This was Neil Agarwal, who's a student of Ruthie Wilson Gilmore's. He asked me this question at Davis. He's like, well, what do you think of the idea that women should be paid for household labor, right? That like you should compute their value into like the amount of money, right? And that's a basis on which to argue for, you know, the value of the labor. I didn't know what to say. It seemed to me like I wouldn't support that. You know, but not support it. Of course, we should do everything we can, but that to me wasn't going to get us somewhere else. That to me wasn't going to get us somewhere else. Yeah.
Stuff. And to me, that it's a way of navigating the existing system rather than undermining it.
Right.
And I shouldn't need to legitimate my ability to exist in the world through being financed through whatever means.
Right.
So whether that's universal income or whether that's yada yada yada. Otherwise, it's just saying, how can I hustle the system in a different way? Which meanwhile, we're in the system, hustle it how you can. But ultimately, if you don't understand that, it's still contributing to the idea that you can only legitimate your existence through money.
Although universal income seems like a little different to me.
I like
the universal income sort of like we all get what we need, and then we go from there.
That's what I'm saying. I'm saying universal income means like, guess what? You're going to get to exist because you exist, even though we're in a money economy. We're going to make sure you can survive in a money economy just because, rather than like, here, let me legitimate this labor, and then you're like, well, what about the people who actually can't do that labor because of ability, but do they still get to exist? No. It's what capitalism says.
Did you have a question?
Oh, no, I'm good.
Oh, you're good? Okay.
I think I would take kind of like a different approach to that.
Yeah.
Given like my studies is on Black motherhood, and Black mothers don't necessarily get legitimated as mothers without the title. Mm-hmm. And so when we think about how racialized motherhood is already policed. I think attaching a monetary value to it would make it more complicated because in a situation where you can already get your kids taken away from you without having a check involved, and you're essentially setting up Black women and other women of color to be fired from their job because there's because in order to get paid, you have to do a job. In order for that job to happen, you have to have criteria. And we all know that those criteria tend to be racialized. So that would be kind of like my concern with that.
Yeah. Thank you.
This is connected, but I was thinking about too, like, as in the relationship between the logistical and the resistant to that. What about like the logistics that is within the resistance and like the promise of the logistic or the manageability? Because, and I'm thinking specifically about like the internal resistance that would happen in this March for Your Lives, or March for Our Lives, where like people were holding banners like "Where were all of you?" and you know, and we didn't get the front news and this and all the and Oprah sponsoring this and that, like all of that. There's so much managerial politics involved in even the like the marches or whatever. It's like the promise or whatever.
There's a question of like the counter logistical, you know? I would like, it's hard to not get autobiographical here. But, you know, like I thought I wanted to write something about like the difference between the way the logistics of the police line when they're trying to like stop direct action, you know what I mean? Versus the kind of counter logistics of people who are like holding hands and singing and in a pod and just trying to like move forward and developing some kind of like deep relationality through the kind of song and holding and like maybe looking even at the difference between like these lines of like, you know, men or women if it's Israel, you know what I mean? And the kind of order that they represent, this depersonalized, you know, the walls that they build, and then the kind of really the counter logistics of the moment of direct action and the kind of thick relationality that is experienced by everyone differently, right? But that is really resituating and powerful in terms of practical consciousness. So yeah, something to think more about that. But I hear you also, like, you know, like I think I hear you also saying that like even protests there are logistics involved with it, right? I mean, I think that there's like I'm not like I think like Spivak, there were some Spivak people saying Spivak in here before, but I think they're all gone because they're all undergraduates. But you know, she says there's no such thing as a non-institutional environment, right? So in some sense, if logistics is just how you operationalize and get stuff done, there's no such thing as a non-logistical one. But they have different bases, and they affect and realize different circulations of relationality, different kinds of social worlds, different collectives, right? I mean, this is my deal with logistics, is the collective it lets us be is nothing, right? It's so penurious, so you know, like it does go back to kind of the Marx, like seeing other people as your limitation rather than your freedom, you know what I mean? So I think, yeah, that's a good point. It's not bad that there are logistics within protests that help people get someplace to do something they want to do. That's good. Yeah.
I'm curious about the Black Bloc part that was taken out.
I think that was a Mimi's word.
Yeah, but you were talking about Nick Estes talking about blockages, like blockades.
Right, yeah, it was just in reaction to that other question about logistics of protest and the Black Bloc.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to say about blockades, right? Glenn Coulthard has a really great thing about the blockades that were part of I Don't Know More, where he says they're both a negation and an affirmation. A negation in the sense that they stop, like, resources, you know, being taken off of occupied indigenous lands, like all of them, he lists them. But they're positive, right, and affirmative, in that they, like, affirm ongoing, reciprocal, indigenous relations between human and non-human world, and, you know, the kind of interconnectivity, and it's building that cycle, those other circulations that I was talking about, right? And what Tiger Swan sees as a blockade, you can really see as like fulfilling a commitment, a responsibility, a renewal of another way, a renewal of a way of being with land and not seeing it as a resource, right? So I like, you know, there's a lot lot to be said about blocking movement, right? And I guess I just wanted this framework of settler capitalist logisticality in some sense. Didn't want to make it seem so totalizing, but wanted to emphasize that disruption is its Achilles heel, right? It's very easy to, people who are really logistics people, which I am not, right? They have this fantasy. It's funny because probably a lot of them don't live in Chicago, but they have this fantasy that if you could get all the Chicago logistics, like the 50,000 Chicago logistics workers to strike, you could close down the global economy. Like $5 billion would be lost in a week. And then I took the train down here last night, and we had to wait an hour because there's a part of the track that was owned by CSX, and nobody could get them on the phone. They weren't answering their phone, and so we're just sitting there on the track. And then we got to Champaign, and there was a freight, a Canadian freight train. Somebody had gone to get dinner, and they just left the train out there. And I'm oh, the power of logistics. You know what I mean? So that point is it's really weak. Right? And blockades that are also about new relationships, forming new relationships at that blockade, or researching the ones that are already there, right, are really part of what I wanted to emphasize. So maybe I should emphasize that more, as well as the as-if and the cartoon music that should play. Right? Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about the right to be unburdened or something?
Unencumbered by concern for others.
Would that be a right to efficiency?
Right to efficiency?
Yeah, right.
For yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, within the logistical logic,
yeah.
Right? It's just asking to be efficient in terms of accumulating.
Yeah,
right.
Literally any blockage is a breaking up your rights. They're really, it shows us the critiques of liberal rights are even more important now, right? Not defend them, but really go even deeper in critiquing them, because they all become the right to be unencumbered by concern for well-being of others and the planet really quickly, right? When they're formed on property and you think about property. But yeah, the logistics workers striking, that would be seen to be violating the human rights of the capitalists, or maybe the stuff to go through. Didn't someone? I forget. I can't tell the story. Sorry, I almost have a name, but I don't have a name, so it would be a bad story. But basically, people now, very powerful 1% people, when they get caught doing something and it's able to be seen as illegal, they say, arresting me is a violation of my human rights, or deposing me is a violation of, deposing a dictator is the violation of his human rights. You know what I mean? It's really amazing, and Mimi would have a lot of things to say about that humanitarianism and that discourse and what it's propping up. And what do we recover? Yeah. Your thoughts?
You asked me if I have thoughts, but I do not have thoughts. I can definitely talk about all the violence that happens under the name of humanitarianism.
Yes.
There's a lot of really interesting work thinking about what do rights mean after the failure of rights as a project, and thinking about questions of alternatives. If we can't go back to rights, because rights was already a project that, I can't remember, I think it's Samuel Moyne who wrote The Last Utopia, and he talks about how rights, people have this genealogy of rights going back to the French and American Republic, civil revolutions or whatever. But he argues that the way in which we understand rights in this moment is actually born out of the failure of revolutions in the 1970s to actually secure, a utopia. And so rights become this compensatory framework for making political claims after the failure of revolution to do so, and how it's fundamentally also anti-political because it is in response to the failure of all these revolutions. So I think it's interesting to think about the rights project and the rights claim after rights in the way in which you're thinking about it in terms of this idea of the right to be unencumbered by others.
But I think, isn't it also that sort of rights and responsibilities has shifted to this vertical axis where where you get rights from up here, and responsibilities up here versus a sort of horizontal, like we have rights between each other and responsibilities with each other, as well as rights and responsibilities to place, right?
I mean, I think that's really important because it gets at one point that I want to make better, which is that the first thing is undermining our sense of ourselves as collective beings, right? Not letting ourselves think of ourselves as collective. And I'm, you know, when we're talking about that, I'm thinking of like the 10-point Black Panther Party, like the 10 demands, right? It's like food, bread, right to determine our own existence, education, you know, housing, you know, and then, you know, then in the post-civil rights period, rights becomes, you know, equal, abstract equality, possessive individualism, right to improve yourself, you know what I mean? It ironically kind of becomes, like again, based around property rights, which people were fighting against. And civil rights are in the White Power era. So yeah, that much more, and that's what it's about, right? It's a we right. It's we, and it's not rights. It's like we, like as a, like our well-being as a collective, you know, is what we want to attend to. And also then, Gary was the but Lisa will talk about that. She will talk about getting rid of laws. And then we will go to dinner. Yeah. Did you?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I just wanted to see if you could comment on Foxconn's strategy in Wisconsin.
Which one?
Foxconn.
Foxconn. I mean, Foxconn is crazy, right? It really is kind of like, I mean, it's part of sort of, you know, the way the global South was underdeveloped coming back into the States, right? That's been happening a lot. But Foxconn is becoming its own zone, right? Where it is a legal issue with Foxconn. If someone tries to sue Foxconn, it doesn't have to go through the courts. It can go right to the Supreme Court, who are all bought by Coke money, right? Or 5 out of 2, you know, 5 out of 7 of them, right? They don't have to obey environmental protection laws, most of them, right? They want to use water in a way that completely contradicts the Great Lakes Water Compact, right? So it really is like its own special zone, and I wanted to focus on the fact that it's undoing laws, right? I mean, deregulation is all about undoing laws that are supposed to protect us collectively, right? But Foxconn is really like a new thing in terms of how much, you know, special treatment it's getting. A similar thing that you see happening now, it's this logistical capitalism. It's like the Back 40 mine, it's the Menominee River, the mouth of the Menominee River. It's where their creation story is. It's 60 miles away from the reservation, and there's a group that is trying not to mine there, but they want to package an exploitation opportunity and then sell it to the highest bidder. So they want to get the permits, they want to get the land, they want to get the legal situation, they want to make sure that all the, you know, every kind of resource that might be needed will be there, and take this exploitation opportunity and then sell it to the highest bidder, whether in China or Saudi Arabia or whatever. That's also kind of a new level, I think. Or maybe not, but everything turns out to be very old when you think about it. But, yeah, thank you for asking that question.
I think we're done.
Thank you guys.